In this video we will talk about politics. It is difficult to propose an ideal political system due to the fact that historical circumstances and the state of technology and so forth will determine what kind of systems are possible and which should be implemented. So politics is not always something timeless, rather it tends to be something that is very time-bound to a specific development and many other factors that are not always available or possible in every era of human existence. However, there are of course certain elements, certain timeless concepts or values that should be implemented in order to have the most timeless political system that works and promotes human health and prosperity. And timeless education is also useful for evaluating existing political ideologies to get to the bottom of why they do not work correctly as intended, or what they are mistaken about, so to speak. Because every ideology, every political ideology has certain common features, such as a concept or idea or theory about what it is that moves history and therefore should be focused on or emphasized about in order to maximize the human possibilities and a functional society. And another feature is that they tend to be very partial and focused and even fixated on this particular aspect that they believe is the motor or fundamental mechanics behind what makes a society work and what needs to be maximized or focused on in order to produce the kind of society that we want. So if we examine the three main modern political ideologies, liberalism, socialism and nationalism, we will find that each of them tends to be very fixated on one particular idea, which does have a legitimate part of the truth. But because they are so focused on just one thing, they don't understand the need for a kind of balance. And at the same time, they also forget to include a fourth concept, which I would refer to as consciousness, the importance of consciousness. But let us begin with liberalism. The main mechanism that liberals believe drives society forward is something like free agency. The freedom of the individual, that if you maximize the freedom of the individual, then you will have creative people creating their own businesses and companies and inventions that will move society forward, and you will have prosperity and a good and functioning society. And because of this partiality towards human freedom and individual freedom, they are often opposed to things that seems to impose on human freedom, such as big government or government in general, and national borders and things like that, making them often at odds with the other two political ideologies of socialism and nationalism. But at the same time, there's something very one-sided in this idea of freedom. It often comes down to the freedom to buy and sell. It's that becomes the main concern, and not other forms of freedom, such as we tend to define freedom in timeless education, which is more the freedom to experience, to express and experience the moment, to understand, to become free from even the need for freedom. That is to say that liberals tend to believe in free will, or at least libertarian free will, which is a fine concept. I do agree that we should be able to speak in terms of, even if we don't believe in free will, we should still be able to talk about the possibility of being able to have free agency within a political system and not have everything determined for us. Obviously, I mean, this is a kind of fallacy that just because there may not be free will, that all of a sudden people should be governed and should be programmed, such as you often have in a more authoritarian system. I guess communism tended to go that way, and this is because, well, there is this idea that determinism or the lack of free will also implies a lack of consciousness. But in timeless education, we examine the causes, the chain of causalities, to also include a natural or inherent aspect that, while not making us free, is still not something that makes us completely empty of anything except external stimuli. We are not simply empty papers that can be programmed just because we don't have true, real freedom or free will. We still are also not just programmed by our environment, but we are also wired, as I used to call it. We have certain particular energies and temperaments that pushes us forward, but against, and often sometimes in opposition to, systems of the environment. So there's a kind of conflict there, and in that conflict we become aware sometimes if we are successful, if circumstances are in our favor, and that leads to the development of something that we can begin to call true will, which is that we detach from both our cultural environment and our own personal drives, and then we observe them and we become familiar with them, and we are able to understand when it benefits us to go along with these, and when it benefits us to control or resist these tendencies. So obviously there is an error, I would say, in the concept of freedom and the disdain or criticism towards the idea of lack of freedom in liberalism, that makes it very focused on a kind of striving and personal accountability that often is exaggerated, and also there is this misunderstanding that freedom can be interpreted in many different ways, and for some people it might feel more like freedom to not have to strive, to not have to take so much responsibility, but to actually be able to just go along with a kind of routine or societal system that makes people that makes them not have to think, and can make them, I guess, focus on other things while at the same time doing a kind of duty. It depends on what your nature is also, but I do think that everyone can benefit from learning to appreciate more the satisfaction that can come from simply letting go as well, so that you are not simply focused on your own destiny, but that you can also feel like you're part of something. It can simply be something like your family, or that you prioritize supporting something greater than yourself, or supporting other people. So there are also different temperaments, different needs in people, and different ideas of freedom, which is why liberalism becomes too much at odds with the other two ideologies, and that what we really need is more of a balance, which is what tends to be the conclusion that we arrive at when we look at these timeless principles. And then if we move on to socialism, the mechanism that socialism believes drives history is people with wealth, or economic wealth is what makes things possible. And therefore, in order to have the greatest possibility and happiness for the most amount of people, you need to have a more of an equal distribution of wealth and a kind of a more democratic economy. And just like the idea of free agency and a need for some amount of individual freedom. And it is true, as liberalism suggests, that free creative individuals are partly what moves history and makes things happen. But it's also true that, as socialism points out, that great wealth and economic resources and money and all this is also something that makes things happen and moves society along. And if you don't have a more equal distribution of wealth, then you cannot have economy. I often hear this argument, for example, from Jordan B. Peterson, who says that leftists or socialists don't really have compassion for the poor. They simply hate the rich or something like that. But that's irrelevant. It's really irrelevant how people feel regarding this, because when people get as rich as they have been doing now after Reagan in the early 80s, he got rid of this tax law which the US had in place, so that people, if they became too rich, people could be rich, but if they became too rich, really super rich, then they would have to pay a very large tax. And by having this incentive to not take out too much money, they could still be rich and take out a lot of money, but by not having the incentive to take out too much, they would put a lot of money back into their companies and back into society and into the economy, so that things were moving much better. But now, after Reagan and neoliberalism took away this law, there was no limit to how much money the richest people could grab for themselves, and that meant that there's less money being put back into the economy, and that makes ordinary people poorer. And even if you make the argument that today people are less poor than they were in the past, that's still irrelevant to what we're talking about here, because the issue here is one of democracy and people having something to say. You cannot have democracy if you have that a small amount of people with that much wealth, because they will determine and influence what happens because of their wealth, because of their money. Even governments will have to do their bidding, so to speak. And that's really the main issue here. So it doesn't really matter if people, whether or not some people envy the rich, or whether the rich has worked hard, or some argument like that. I mean, we need, unless we want the people with money to basically run the world, then we need to put some kind of brake on how much money a person can have. Because why does a person really need that money? They don't need that money not to live a wealthy life. What they are doing with that kind of money is basically run the world. So that's really the main issue here. However, the problem with socialism and communism and the extreme left is that they tend to become too fixated on this idea of equality, so that it no longer simply remains at trying to even out the wealth, but it becomes a focus and a fixation of removing all kinds of differences. And this focus and sort of igniting the rage of the poorer masses against the elites often leads to merely a violent mob that attacks the rich, but which, because of the revolutionary aspect of it, tends to destroy wealth, because there is no proper coordination to set up a new system of wealth. And there also tends to be opportunists, because socialists tends to be too focused on structures being the cause of evil. They don't understand that sometimes there are certain people with certain temperaments, that human nature and certain human character traits will play a part in how human beings behave, and that some people have a propensity to prefer being a kind of criminal, or someone who basically takes what they want by violence, and that this is not simply because they are poor, but because certain people are driven by certain energies. And this, by not taking this into consideration, once a revolution happens, those kind of people who are more tyrannical and careless tends to simply take over. They take the opportunity to set themselves up for power, and that's why you sometimes have, after these revolutions, an even worse system than before. And so that's the problem with socialism and communism and all this. And then the third ideology is nationalism, which and the mechanic that nationalists tend to perceive, or the extreme right, or the right in general, tend to perceive as what drives history, is something like special individuals, remarkable people who become strong charismatic leaders, or great inventors, or spiritual guides, or something like that, and who introduce great ideas and great ideals into the culture, and then rises the culture for everyone, for the masses, as long as the masses supports them. And obviously they would prefer that in tandem with a strong and charismatic leader who makes things happen, that you also have loyal subjects and people who support this leader rather than get in the way or oppose this leader. And that's why this idea of a unity, a national unity, because obviously if the group is too big, it's difficult to keep it into a cohesive unity. And I think that's part of why people who believe that the world needs strong leaders also desires strong national borders and basically nationalism, because the country represents unity at the largest scale that is still manageable in some sense. And obviously there tends to be a mistrust of foreigners and other people with other ideals. But the weakness of this idea is that while it's true, just like in the case of the other ideologies, that there does indeed exist remarkable people who do make things happen, and we have examples of spiritual gurus who live behind books and scriptures that people submit to and follow and even worship. While it's true that those people exist and thus influence history, when you become too focused on that, it tends to become too oppressive, and it's very difficult to find a leader who actually is truly great. It is easier for people who are narcissistic and who desire to be visible and display themselves and seduce people with big promises and things like that to basically take the opportunity to present themselves in attractive ways, and often are able to seduce large amount of people, while at the same time they only surround themselves with the most loyal people, the most loyal subjects, and basically they focus too much on the military and on focusing on their own wealth and power at the expense of the people, because when you focus that much on the military, which often is an aspect of the more nationalistic you are, the more you want a strong military to defend the borders and maybe even invade some other countries in order to perpetuate your great nation. Some nationalists says that imperialism is actually the opposite of nationalism, but I perceive it as I perceive nationalism as actually having the seed of imperialism in it. There can be other motivations for imperialism, but obviously we have seen in history many nations turning into imperialism. I mean, Nazi Germany is considered a nationalist ideology, and yet it invaded other countries because it wanted to spread their great culture to people who they considered to be related to their great race and things like that. So I don't think that it is accurate. I think it's a bit naive to say that imperialism is the opposite of nationalism. And also with a strong military, it often happens that large amount of money is spent on a strong military at the expense of the ordinary people who might be starving or suffer other problems that we see in smaller and very nationalistic societies and countries such as North Korea, for example. So nationalism often falls into this problem of tyrannical dictatorships due to the narcissistic tendency of people who wants to take on that role as a strong leader. That's the problem, that's the problematic fixation of the extreme right and nationalisms, who often idealizes the strong leader of the past, such as the king. Some of them want to go back to a kind of monarchy or feudal society and things like that. But obviously, history does not tend to move backwards. I don't think we have ever seen a case where a modern country, I mean, perhaps we have seen things going back into a kind of repressive regime, but not going all the way back to an earlier historical period type system, at least not in the West. And obviously nationalists will perceive liberalism and socialism as being obstacles to bringing forth these strong leader types or excellent people with merits, because individual freedom, such as in liberalism, doesn't tend to work or live for something greater, to achieve something beyond simply the freedom to buy and sell. They will often compare these people to simply pursuing the satisfaction of their baser instincts. But the problem of following a strong leader or ideal or national ideals is that it tends to become very robotic, and there tends to be an intolerance of differences and the freedom of individual expressions. Fascist or authoritarian regimes tends to be the enemy of art and thought, for example. And obviously there is sometimes a difference between those people who philosophize regarding the original ideology. There is, for example, this idea on the right of a so-called third position, which I simply call it ideological or political fascism, which is kind of different from the fascism that we have seen. And often these people will say that, well, what people call fascism isn't true fascism. And while that might be true, that's always the excuse. It's the same thing that we have seen with socialists, who says that the communism we have seen is not real communism. And anarcho-capitalists who have said that the capitalism or liberalism that we have seen is not true capitalism. But of course, the response to all of these excuses is that that's the system you get. Because whenever you try to implement all of these political, theoretical ideas, then they will inevitably encounter resistance. They will encounter reality and things that they have not taken into consideration, and that this will change the course of what happens, and the result is not going to be what they thought would be possible, because you cannot simply do whatever you want just because you think that this could work in theory. The best approach is to simply try to go with the flow, to see where things are moving, and then try to follow along and improve through a kind of renewal, rather than trying to approach things as if you are trying to work on an empty board where, well, okay, we just scrap everything and then we try this and this and this. And that doesn't really work, because everything is very complicated and there are many things that are moving, that are constantly moving, and many factors within the human beings, the way they are naturally wired, and people don't fully understand. The way people are brought up, the invisible structures that keep people down, that people are also not always aware of. And then there is also the question of what the needs of the current period is. So for example, today there is the issue of the environment, and there might be the issue of nuclear powers, or the amount of nuclear weapons in the world, and many things like that. There are many factors that are very difficult to keep in memory and in mind when developing certain political or society or plans for society that people wish to implement, for example. And when we look at these three modern ideologies, we can perceive that if we look at the dimensions or aspects of the human being, we see that these three each correlate pretty well with one of these dimensions. So for example, liberalism, that emphasizes the freedom of the individual, could be said to correlate or be analogous to the vital sphere, that does deal with freedom, the need for freedom in order to have health. Even if they have a different conception or definition of freedom, we can still see that we can perhaps improve liberalism if we correct and talk more about how we should consider freedom, and then also try to balance it out with other ideas. Then if we look at socialism, then we can see, as the name implies, that it correlates mostly with the feelings and the community, the social sphere, and correctly points out the need for some kind of democracy, to give local groups a feeling that they have something to say, even if there is a legitimate criticism to be had of too much democracy, and that the masses do tend to be ignorant, and consciousness tend to deteriorate in groups, and thus we should not put all our faith in simply having democracy. But we do need some form of democracy, and especially when it comes to the economy, and so that people feel that they have a say in the economy. So, for example, if some company wants to use the resources of a local area, then those people should be able to vote whether or not they should allow this company to use the resources in their area. And if they allow this, then they should also get something in return, some part of the profit, as a kind of I don't know, maybe a universal basic income or something similar. They have something like that in Alaska, I think, where the people in that area gets some money every month because of the resources that are being drawn from there. But in most places, there is no such compensation, and many times people don't even have a say. The government or some kind of company simply moves in and basically takes resources because there is no democratic economy. And I think most people can agree that we need something like this, at least. And then if we look at nationalism, or this idea of striving for an ideal or respecting some kind of authority or guiding idea, then we can perhaps correlate that with the intellect and concepts, since these people tend to be there tends to be a kind of respect for religion and the idea of spirituality, even if they perhaps don't conceptualize it or understand it correctly, and obviously they often can become too fixated on that and simply value the ideal of the human spirit over ordinary life. But in practice they do tend to be very material as well, since such a thing as strong borders and putting effort into this image of strength and a strong military and things like that tends to be very materialistic. So there is a kind of contradiction there that often happens within all of these ideologies. For example, socialism and communism tends to present itself as being very sort of compassionate and caring about people in the lower classes of society, but at the same time it can be very ruthless in their in the way their mobs attack. And this is of course not a display of friendliness or compassion towards what they perceive as their ideological enemies, for example. So there's always this kind of hypocrisy and contradiction that happens when you don't have balance and when you only focus on your own partial ideas and wishes. And most of these people, they are of course not enlightened, and when they are drawn to these ideologies and want to become part of them and realize them, it often is because they are running on a kind of feeling of lack, like they need this in order to be happy and for things to be good. And what we need is to be able to appreciate life before we start to implement ideas. Otherwise we will going in trying to fix things while not being entirely objective and healthy and emotionally and rationally stable. And that is the problem that I tend to see within all of these ideologies. They tend to be so focused on trying to get their own ideas and systems through and implemented and sustained if they are implemented, that they tend to become opposed to this idea of people knowing what's going on. They want to have control of information. They want obedient citizens that supports the political system, whatever it might be. And this is why all systems tends to be able to be comparable to a kind of fascism or authoritarianism. People always draw the parallel or reference George Orwell's 1984, for example, regardless of what system it is, whether it is the neoliberalism of the West, or if it is the communist China of the East, or whether it is some kind of nationalist dictatorship. All of it often devolves into the same antagonism towards consciousness and wants people to basically remain in the dark and not question things. And that's why I think it's important to have a new kind of politics. And that's one of the things that I wanted to emphasize here, because some people might speculate what I am, and they might have asked me or called me, well, it sounds like you're a liberal, or sounds like you are a leftist, or something like that. And that's because they make assumptions about, but I don't actually have a political stance exactly. And if I do have one, then I am partly making this video to try to get it across that I am critical of all of these modern political ideologies. And if I do emphasize or believe in some kind of political system, it would be a new one that I would probably call conscious politics, in order to emphasize this element that tends to be missing in the other political systems, and that is that we need to have an ideal of the search for truth and the search for genuineness, and also a kind of search for compassion, for a competence in relationship, by trying to find some way to become more friendly to each other, so we don't have all of these wars and conflicts and resentments among people in various political groups, because people are often driven by this kind of emotional lack of control, which I have described as a kind of weakness. And that's why I often describe war as a kind of weakness. And some people might think that war is natural, and that we should have some kind of war so that human beings always test their strength and improve their strength. But I can really regard that as a kind of weakness, because if you're going to have a war without this weak component of uncontrolled emotions and lack of being able to resist this petty anger and blame on the external, then you would have to invent some kind of contrived way to engage in a kind of war or conflict without that hate. And I don't really see that happen, since most people aren't really warlike. But going back to this point about the search for truth, what we need, since all of these other ideologies lack that, and since consciousness and awareness is a very big feature of timeless education and also real spirituality in general, then obviously we should emphasize that, along with things like the ideal of freedom of expression, in order to emphasize the value of this in any functional and wise culture. And by the search for truth, I also am referring to because you may have already some kind of parts of the truth found that are established in the culture, such as something that we know functions very well, such as freedom of expression, for example. Now, obviously, we don't have absolute freedom of expression, because we know that trying to incite violence towards certain groups will lead to problems. So obviously it's not a completely perfect ideal, but still it works very well and can be considered something like truth. But that does never neglect the need for a kind of perpetual or continuous search for truth and genuineness, because we also need to familiarize ourselves and adapt to ourselves and learn about who we are and how we function and what we want as individual human beings. And that requires also a search for a kind of personal truth. And that is especially important the more repressive a system is. The less a system allows you to be yourself, the more you're going to be dissatisfied, and the more you're going to deeply inside want to find out what you really want and why you're unhappy, so to speak. But I believe that in a culture that is more open to this impulse and gives you the freedom to pursue that, especially at the young age, then you can probably find yourself and the meaning you seek faster, and that way, especially with a little bit of competent guidance. so that you don't go all your life confused about who you are and searching for meaning and truth, but that you then later can do your small part in helping the society, and not simply be focused on yourself and your own needs, but to find that personal substance, so that you can also work for the group and your community, and also help and support others, so that you feel a kind of substance, not only from being your true self, but also finding substance in helping other people, or being someone who contributes. And for those people who take on the role of leader, they should also look upon themselves as a kind of servant, someone who serves the community. You shouldn't have too much flair and attractive image in the leader. The leader should be regarded as being almost equal a plumber, or someone who's simply fulfilling a functional role, because then you will have a much more focus on competence and serving the people in the leader, rather than things turning the other way around, so that the people become simply something that are there to support the leader and the country, or some kind of abstract concept of greatness that never really lives up to its own promises. Because it again goes back to this idea of for what should humanity strive? And while it is fine to search, to strive for some kind of noble goal and all this stuff, it must be done in a way that we can agree upon, that we can naturally feel that we want to be a part of, and not simply submit ourselves to some leader who may have big promises, but who we ultimately don't know what he is up to and what he will try to do, because talk is cheap and people can make all kinds of promises. And so, this is a very big subject, and I wasn't sure how much I was going to say in this video, and I don't know how much I would cut away, but I kind of want to know what kind of what you think of these ideas, and what you think of these political systems, if you consider yourselves belonging to one of them, and if perhaps you think that my assessment of them has been unfair, that I have perhaps simplified them a bit too much. I do know that, for example, within the left, for example, there are a lot of intellectuals that are very difficult to understand, and that is of course a problem, because you do need to make ordinary people understand. And I hope I have been somewhat fair here, because I don't really put these ideologies in a hierarchy. I know that there are other systems, such as spiral dynamics, that places the search for equality, such as in socialism, on stage green, which is higher than stage orange, which is basically strong individualism, something like liberalism. And then underneath that you have the stage blue, which is very strongly nationalistic. And while I can understand in some ways why people might look at things that way, in that things do evolve, and the further back you go, the more things appear to be nationalistic, and the more things have, the way society is moving, it tends to become more focused on individual freedom and also on equality. But at the same time, it is important to understand that each of these ideologies and people belonging to these ideologies can belong to different levels of consciousness. You can have a nationalist at level 4 and another nationalist at level 5 and another at level 6 and another at level 7. And you can have, same with socialism, you can have a socialist at level 4, a socialist at level 5, 6 and so on. And depending on where they are, they will often have different views, even if they both a nationalist or socialist on level 4 will actually have a different socialism or nationalism compared to a socialist or nationalist on level 5 or 6. And this is why people often don't get along, because they believe they are on the same page, because they are only focused on the superficiality of words and terms. And they say that, well, if you are socialists, if you call yourself a socialist, then you're my brother and we are on the same side. But actually people put in their own meanings into these ideas. And some people have more elaborate understanding and theories regarding these ideologies, while others are more superficial and more simply going along with the crowd and basically only focus on slogans and understand the slogans. And that way you have different levels of consciousness and different health and different types of competence. So some people are much less competent in their promotion and living out of these ideologies, while others are much more sophisticated and smarter and wiser and so forth. And I don't know how far these can reach in the developments. I don't know if they can reach level 3 and 2, for example, but obviously they cannot reach the highest level, because they are so partial. They need to emphasize much more a harmonization and integration of all of the essential components of these worldviews in order to start to reach the higher levels. But if there is anything you want to say or comment on this, because this is something I will be writing a bit about, I think, in books or on the blog or somewhere, and that's why I'm interested in hearing if you have some kind of something to say. So I leave it there for now, and I will probably talk more about this, but this is take this as an introduction, as a way to throw it out there and give you some idea of how I look at this and what I would suggest, and basically make it clear that I do not refer to myself as any of these common ideologies that we know of, and that I really would like to find a new way, a new name, and perhaps also a new theory, make up a new theory. But it's such a big project that I could probably focus much more on simply the development of personal consciousness rather than political. It is inevitable that you have to say something when you are a philosopher on how society should ideally run in order to be functional. So I leave it there, and I hope that this has been of interest to you.